They said the German Shepherd was useless. Broken leg, no bite, no value. $10 take him or send him away. What they didn't know was that the man standing there already knew that look. David Walker was 45, a former police K-9 handler living in a quiet Wyoming town haunted by a blast that never left his head. That night when the nightmares came, the dog didn't run. He stood guard, like it was his job. And that was the moment David realized this dog hadn't been abandoned. He had been erased. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Winter pressed down on the Wyoming foothills with a dull, breathless cold, the kind that muted sound and made even familiar places feel distant and slightly unreal. David Walker had learned to live inside that quiet. At 45, he moved through his days with the controlled precision of a man who no longer trusted sudden motion or noise. He lived alone in a weathered log house at the edge of a mountain town, whose name barely appeared on maps, a place of gas stations, one grocery store, and long stretches of road where nothing interrupted the horizon. David had chosen it because it was far enough from people and close enough to silence. 3 years earlier, he had left the police force after an explosion during a routine call shattered more than concrete and steel. The blast took his partner and his K-9, a German Shepherd he had trained from a clumsy, oversized pup, into a disciplined working dog. David survived. The guilt of that survival had settled into his bones and never left. Since then, sleep came in fragments. Crowds made his chest tighten, and the sound of metal striking metal could still drag him backward without warning. That morning he dressed the way he always did, when he forced himself outside a dark brown leather jacket softened by age and use a red and navy flannel shirt beneath it, faded jeans worn thin at the knees, insulated leather boots built for cold ground, and a gray wool scarf wrapped once around his neck. He caught his reflection in the cracked mirror by the door. Broad-shouldered with a square jaw, lined by rough stubble, and hair gone prematurely gray at the temples, he looked older than 45. His eyes, pale and tired, belonged to someone who slept with one ear open. He told himself he was leaving the house to look for spare parts, maybe a hinge or a tool, something practical. In truth, he just needed proof that the world still existed beyond his walls. The flea market sat off the highway in a broken parking lot behind an abandoned feed store. Canvas tents flapped in the wind, held down by bricks and old tires. Radios murmured classic rock and country songs through static. David parked at the far edge, giving himself space. He moved slowly between tables stacked with rusted tools and mismatched kitchenware, shoulders. Tight hands curled slightly, as if ready to steady himself. The sharp clatter of metal when a vendor dropped a box of wrenches made his breath hitch, but he counted silently and kept walking. He was almost back to his truck when he heard shouting. Not bargaining. Anger. Near a chain-link fence where weeds pushed through cracked asphalt, a middle-aged man stood over a German Shepherd, tied with a frayed rope. The man was thick through the shoulders, red-faced with thinning hair plastered under a stained cap. His movements were impatient and careless, his voice sharp as he yanked the rope and delivered a quick kick that landed just short of full force. The dog did not growl or pull away. He was large, black, and tan. His coat dulled by dirt, one hind leg held slightly wrong beneath him, as if it had healed badly long ago. His ribs showed faintly when he breathed. What stopped David cold was the dog's eyes. Amber, steady, frighteningly calm. No panic, no pleading, just awareness. David felt the market fall away. That look had lived in his memory for 3 years, burned there by smoke and heat. It was the same look his K9 had given him in the seconds before the explosion, still watching, still waiting for direction, even as the world collapsed. His chest tightened, and for a moment he had to grip the edge of a nearby table to stay upright. Useless, the man snapped more to the air than to David. Legs shot. Eats too much. Can't guard anything. He spat onto the pavement. $10. Otherwise he goes to the shelter. David forced himself closer. Each step felt deliberate, like entering a hostile scene. He crouched slowly, ignoring the ache in his knees, bringing himself level with the dog. The German Shepherd tracked him, with his ears flicking once before settling again. No fear, no trust, just attention. David noticed the scars beneath the fur, the way the dog held himself with discipline, despite the injury. This was not an animal that had given up. This was one that had learned endurance. "I'll take him," David said. His voice came out rough but steady. He pulled a crumpled $10 bill from his pocket and held it out. The man blinked, surprised, then snatched the money without ceremony. "Your problem now," he muttered, already turning away. David untied the rope, his hands shaking slightly, despite his effort to stay calm. The dog rose with care, favoring the injured leg, then stood at David's side, as if that was where he belonged. As they walked back toward the truck, a light snow began to fall, quiet and relentless. David opened the passenger door, hesitating for half a second, unsure how this was supposed to go. The dog did not wait for a command. He climbed in, carefully turned once, and sat upright, facing forward, posture straight. It was the way working dogs sat when they were ready. David closed the door and rested his forehead briefly against the cold metal frame. "I don't know why you're here," he whispered, "but you're not going back." The dog did not move. He only watched, present and unblinking. That night the house settled into its familiar creaks and groans as the temperature dropped. David laid an old blanket near the wall, not too close to his bed, not too far either. The dog lowered himself onto it without a sound, curling carefully around his injured leg. David did not give him a name. Names carried weight. Names turned into ghosts. He lay down, fully clothed boots by the bed, and waited for sleep. When it came violently. Fire, pressure, the scream of tearing metal. David woke with a gasp, heart slamming, the taste of smoke sharp in his mouth. He sat upright, hands searching for something solid, breath trapped high in his chest. For a second he did not know where he was. Then he saw the doorway. The German Shepherd stood there, body angled between David and the hall, muscles taut, head lifted, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. He did not bark. He did not retreat. He stood guard. David swallowed hard, his voice barely audible as he spoke into the quiet. "That's not possible," he whispered. "You're not just a dog." The light seemed to dim around them, the house holding its breath, and there was no answer, only the steady presence of something that refused to leave. Cold light filtered through the Wyoming morning, thin and pale, turning the frost on the windows into a dull sheet of white that made the house feel suspended between night and day. David Walker woke before dawn, as he usually did, his body still wired to a schedule it no longer needed. For a few seconds he lay still, listening. The house creaked as it warmed old wood, adjusting to the cold. His breath came slow, measured. No sirens, no sudden clang of metal. Then he remembered he was not alone. The German Shepherd lay on the blanket near the wall, massive body folded carefully around the injured hind leg, head resting on his paws. In the dim light, the dog's eyes were open, watching David without moving, not staring, monitoring. David felt a flicker of unease, followed by something quieter and harder to name. He sat up, boots still on from the night before, and rubbed a hand over his face. "You didn't sleep, did you?" he murmured. The dog's ears shifted slightly, but he did not rise. David moved through the kitchen on habit, setting a kettle on the stove, careful not to let the metal ring too loudly. When a spoon slipped from his hand and struck the counter, the sound was sharp and sudden. His chest tightened reflexively. Before his breath could spike, the dog was on his feet, moving with controlled speed, placing himself between David and the counter, body angled toward the source of the noise. He did not bark. He did not retreat. He simply stood there, head lowered slightly, eyes scanning as if expecting a threat to emerge from the steel and laminate. The reaction was so precise it stole the air from David's lungs. He forced himself to breathe, counting silently, and watched the dog ease back only when his own shoulders lowered. "That wasn't panic," David said under his breath. He knew panic. Panic was messy, loud, unthinking. This had been measured. Tactical. The dog had assessed the sound, placed himself accordingly, and waited for a cue that never came. David poured water into a bowl and set it down. The dog sniffed, drank a few mouthfuls, then stopped, eyes flicking back to David as if water was secondary to something else. David frowned. He filled another bowl with dry food he kept for strays. The dog glanced at it and turned his head away. Hunger did not outrank vigilance. David recognized that hierarchy with a jolt of familiarity. By mid-morning, the sky had brightened, though the cold remained. David stepped into the small workshop attached to the house, a place he avoided because of the tools, the metal shelves, the memories they carried. He needed to know. He lifted a wrench deliberately and let it drop from a short height onto the concrete. The clang echoed sharp and clean. His heart kicked hard in his chest, a surge of heat crawling up his spine. The dog reacted instantly, faster than David's own conscious thought. He moved to David's side, close, but not touching, body pressed just enough to be felt grounding without crowding. His breathing slowed, exaggerated a steady rhythm David felt more than heard. David matched it without realizing he had. The panic stalled, confused, then ebbed. David sank onto a crate, hands shaking, and stared at the dog. "That's trained," he said quietly. "That's not instinct. Instinct would have driven the dog to flee or bark. This was something else entirely, something drilled deep enough to surface under stress without command." David reached for his phone, hesitated, then opened the voice recorder. "Noise trigger," he said softly. "Metal." He responded before I did. His voice sounded thin to his own ears, but there was a strange steadiness beneath it. He stopped the recording and slipped the phone into his pocket. He spent the rest of the day testing carefully, deliberately, never pushing too far. A dropped tool. A door closed harder than intended. Each time the dog adjusted with precision, positioning himself between David and the perceived threat, modulating distance, never overwhelming. When David's breathing steadied, the dog eased back, resuming a watchful stillness. By late afternoon, David's exhaustion had settled into his muscles, but beneath it was a growing clarity. This animal had not learned these behaviors by chance. Someone had taught him. Someone had relied on him. As dusk fell, David sat at the small kitchen table, staring at his hands. He thought of the dog as a puppy, once all oversized paws and clumsy enthusiasm, molded patiently into discipline. He thought of handlers who spoke in low voices of long nights and shared routines. The idea that this dog had once belonged to a unit, to a purpose, tightened something in his chest. He realized he had been referring to the dog as he without thinking. That too felt dangerous. Names created bonds. Bonds created loss. And yet when the dog rose and came to sit near his chair, positioning himself at David's side with unconscious familiarity, the decision made itself. Rex David said, testing the sound. The name hung in the air, simple and solid. The dog's ears flicked his head, turning just enough to acknowledge it. No tail wag. No exuberance. Just recognition. David exhaled slowly. "All right, Rex," he added, voice rough. "You can stay." That night, sleep came in shallow waves. David woke twice, once from a dream he could not remember, once from a sudden thud outside that turned out to be a branch striking the siding. Each time, Rex was already alert, already positioned, already watching. By morning, David's fatigue was deep, but something else had taken root alongside it. Curiosity. Purpose's distant echo. He brewed coffee he barely touched, and watched Rex pace the perimeter of the room, methodical injured leg compensating without complaint. David opened his phone again, scrolling through old contacts he had not called in years, then stopped himself. He was not ready to pull anyone else into this. Not yet. First, he needed answers. He knelt in front of Rex, careful not to crowd him, studying the scars beneath the fur, the way the dog held himself like someone waiting for orders that would never come. "You had a job," David said quietly. "Didn't you?" Rex's gaze held steady, unreadable, but present. As the light strengthened outside, David made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like an acknowledgement. This dog had not been abandoned by accident. Whatever work he had been trained to do, it had been taken from him. And David, who knew what it meant to lose a badge and be cut loose from purpose, felt the weight of that truth settle in his chest. He did not yet know how deep it went, only that the reactions he had witnessed could not be explained away. This was not survival. This was discipline without assignment. And for the first time in 3 years, David felt himself leaning toward the question instead of away from it. Snow fell in a thin, steady curtain over the Wyoming plains, the sky low and colorless, as if the world had narrowed itself to the road ahead and the quiet inside the truck. David Walker drove with both hands locked on the wheel jaw, tight eyes fixed forward. Rex sat in the passenger seat, posture upright, despite the injured hind leg head level, with the windshield tracking the movement of passing fences and bare cottonwoods. The town's veterinary clinic stood alone at the edge of a service road, a squat building of pale siding and frosted windows that smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay. David parked and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. He had brought Rex here because he could no longer pretend curiosity was harmless. Every measured reaction, every controlled movement had sharpened into a question he could not ignore. He rested his palm briefly on Rex's shoulder, feeling solid muscle beneath the coat. "We're just getting checked," he said, more to himself than to the dog. Rex's ears flicked once. Dr. Emily Carter met them at the door. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades delivering truths people did not always want to hear. She was tall and lean, her posture straight without stiffness, ash blonde hair pulled back into a practical braid that revealed a face lined by Wyoming sun and wind rather than age. Her eyes were a calm gray, observant without intrusion. Emily had grown up outside Casper on a cattle ranch and returned after veterinary school, choosing community over prestige. She had treated everything from injured horses to retired police dogs, and there was very little that surprised her anymore. She glanced from David to Rex and nodded once. "You must be David," she said. "And you're the one everyone's been whispering about." Rex studied her steadily, body still, neither shrinking nor advancing. Inside the exam room was warm and quiet. Emily moved slowly, hands visible, voice low. "You can set him here." Rex stepped onto the mat without prompting, positioning himself precisely where she indicated. Emily noted it with a flicker of interest she did not comment on. She examined the injured leg, first fingers tracing old scar tissue with practiced care. "This didn't heal clean," she murmured. "Trauma years back." David swallowed. He had heard that word enough to know its weight. She checked joints' heart rate reflexes. Rex endured it all without flinching eyes, never leaving David. When Emily reached behind Rex's left shoulder blade, her fingers paused. "There's something here," she said quietly. David's chest tightened. "What kind of something could be a chip?" Emily replied, reaching for a scanner. She passed it once. Nothing. Adjusted the angle. Tried again. A faint beep cut through the room. Emily's brows drew together. She adjusted the settings and scanned again. The beep returned, steadier this time. She turned the device toward herself, reading silently. The room seemed to contract around them. David felt the shift before she spoke. "This isn't a civilian microchip," Emily said at last. Her voice remained even, but there was no mistaking the significance. "It's federal issue. Older model. They stopped using these because they were prone to damage." She cleared her throat. "This one's partially corrupted, but there's enough data left." David sank onto the stool behind him, without realizing his knees had given out. "You're sure?" Emily nodded. "I trained on these early in my career." She tapped the screen. "Designation indicates a K-9 assigned to a federal task force." David's ears rang faintly. Federal, not municipal, not his. Emily continued each word careful. Status missing, presumed deceased. She hesitated, then added, "Cause listed explosion during an operation 4 years ago." David closed his eyes. 4 years. The timeline slammed into place with brutal clarity. "Handler?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Not you," Emily said gently. "Different unit." Rex stood between them, tail still, ears forward, as if the words meant nothing beyond tone. David stared at the dog, at the calm discipline etched into every line of his body. "He didn't die," David said. It was not a question. "No?" Emily agreed. He disappeared. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling. David pictured Rex after the blast, injured, unaccounted for paperwork, filed a line drawn through a name. He imagined what came next, transfer neglect sale. He had seen how systems failed people. He had not wanted to believe they failed dogs the same way. "How does a federal K-9 end up tied to a fence at a flea market?" he asked. Emily leaned back against the counter, folding her arms. "There are cracks," she said carefully, "especially after operations. Sometimes locals take dogs in. Sometimes records don't follow. Sometimes animals get passed hand to hand when they're no longer considered assets." She met David's gaze. "And sometimes someone makes money off what slips through." Anger rose sharp and clean, cutting through the fog David had lived in for years. He thought of the man at the fence, of the casual cruelty of $10 exchanged without a second thought. "They wrote him off," David said. "Like he didn't count." Emily's expression softened. They underestimated what couldn't be erased. She printed a thin report and handed it to him. "There's a serial number here. It doesn't just tell us who he was. It suggests movement. A trail, if someone wanted to look." David folded the paper carefully, as if it might tear under the pressure of his grip. He knelt in front of Rex, meeting the dog's steady gaze. "You were never allowed to come back," he said quietly. The words settled heavy and undeniable. Rex did not move. He stayed. When they stepped back into the cold, the snow had thickened. David paused beside the truck, breath visible, the world stark and real. He realized the unease in his chest was no longer just fear. It was recognition. He had lost his badge and his partner, and been expected to vanish quietly into civilian life. Rex had lost his handler and his assignment and been erased entirely. Different species. Same outcome. David opened the passenger door. Rex climbed in with the same practiced care, sitting upright, eyes forward. David started the engine and pulled away the clinic, shrinking behind them. He did not know yet what he would do with the truth Emily had placed in his hands. He only knew this much: Rex had not been abandoned by accident. Some dogs were never meant to return. And David Walker, who understood what it meant to be cut loose from purpose, felt something shift inside him as the road unspooled ahead. A low gray sky pressed down on the Wyoming valley, the air sharp with the promise of more snow, as if the land itself were holding its breath. David Walker stood on the porch of his cabin, leather jacket, zipped high gray wool scarf pulled close to his throat. The cold helped him think. Since the visit to Dr. Emily Carter, the truth about Rex had followed him like a shadow. Federal K-9. Missing. Presumed dead. A life erased with paperwork. David knew that feeling too well. The question was no longer whether Rex had been trained, but what had happened after he vanished. And there was only one person David trusted enough to ask, without explanations or pity. Mark Reynolds answered on the third ring. Mark was 48, broad through the chest, with a square face permanently marked by years of squinting into sun and headlights. His hair had gone iron gray early, his beard kept trimmed not for style, but habit. He had been a detective for over 2 decades, the kind who listened more than he spoke, shaped by cases that taught him patience over force. A bad call years earlier, one that put an innocent man in the hospital, had left Mark slower to judge and harder on himself, but fiercely loyal to the few people he trusted. David Mark said, "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "I didn't either," David replied. "I just need you to listen. Off the record." They met that afternoon at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Rex stayed in the truck at David's insistence, sitting upright in the passenger seat, eyes tracking movement through the windshield. Inside, Mark slid into the booth across from David, studying his face. "You look like hell," he said without cruelty. "Feels familiar," David answered. He told Mark about the flea market, about Rex, about the chip. He did not dramatize it. He didn't have to. Mark's expression changed with each detail, skepticism giving way to something colder and more focused. "You're saying a Federal K-9 ends up sold for $10, Mark said slowly. "That doesn't happen by accident. That's what I'm afraid of," David replied. Mark leaned back, eyes narrowing. "We've had warehouse break-ins, clean jobs, no alarms tripped, all within a mile of that flea market." He paused. "And last week a night watchman didn't come home." David's pulse quickened. "Missing, yeah. 32 years old. Name's Evan Brooks. No criminal history, just vanished." David felt the old pull, the instinct to step back into the work. He shut it down just as quickly. "I'm not coming back," he said. Mark held up a hand. "I'm not asking you to. I just want you to walk with me. Look. Tell me what you see." That evening they stood near the chain of warehouses lining the highway, the same stretch of cracked asphalt that led toward the flea market. Snow drifted lazily through the floodlights. Rex moved at David's side, now harness-fitted but leash, loose injured leg carefully compensated for. He worked with his nose-low movements, deliberate, never rushing. Mark watched with open respect. "That dog's still working," he said quietly. Rex followed a scent trail along the edge of a loading dock, weaving past stacked pallets and discarded crates. David focused on his breathing, on the rhythm of Rex's steps, grounding himself in the present. For a while, it worked. Then a steel door somewhere down the line slammed shut. The sound ricocheted through the narrow corridor like a gunshot. David froze. His body locked before his mind could catch up. Heat surged vision, narrowing the world, tilting back toward smoke and chaos. His breath stalled halfway in. He was no longer standing beside Mark. He was somewhere else entirely. Rex reacted instantly. He surged into David's space, pressing his shoulder firmly against David's thigh weight, solid and unmistakably real. His breathing shifted, deep, exaggerated, steady, broadcasting a rhythm David's body recognized even as his mind fought it. Rex angled himself to block David's view of the corridor, forcing his focus downward, inward. In Mark's voice came distantly, "David, stay with me." David clutched at Rex's fur fingers, digging in, grounding himself in texture and warmth. One breath hitched, then another followed the dog's lead. Slowly, the ringing in his ears softened. The present crept back in. Concrete. Cold air. Rex. David slid down against the wall, shaking but conscious. Rex stayed close, not crowding, not retreating, eyes locked on David's face until his breathing steadied. Mark knelt a few feet away, giving space. "You good?" he asked quietly. David swallowed hard. "I am now." He looked down at Rex, something fierce and grateful breaking through the exhaustion. "That wasn't training for me," he said. "That was him." They moved again, once David nodded. Rex resumed the trail, turning sharply behind a stack of pallets. He stopped, head lifting, and gave a short, controlled bark. David's pulse jumped, not with panic this time, but recognition. "Someone's here," he said. They found Evan Brooks slumped behind a dumpster, dehydrated and shaken, but alive. Relief hit Mark like a physical force as he called it in. David stood back, watching Rex sit near Evan, posture, calm, watchful, as if guarding a fragile perimeter. As paramedics arrived, Mark joined David. "You froze," he said carefully. "But you came back." David nodded, looking at Rex. "I didn't come back on my own." Later, as the lights faded and the scene cleared, David leaned against his truck, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Rex sat beside him, eyes scanning the dark out of habit. David rested a hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm. For the first time since leaving the force, he didn't feel pulled toward the badge or the uniform. What Rex had given him wasn't a way back into the job. It was a way back into himself. The work might never be his again. But the man he had been, the one who could breathe through fear and choose to stay, was still there. And Rex, silent and steadfast, had reminded him. Snow softened the edges of the Wyoming town, a quiet dusk settling in, as if the land itself were learning how to listen. David Walker stood outside the county building with his hands in his jacket pockets, breath clouding in the cold. The last few weeks had unfolded with a strange inevitability, each truth stacking on the next, until denial was no longer possible. Mark Reynolds had been right. The investigation widened quickly once the pattern was seen clearly. Injured working dogs written off after operations, their records marked incomplete or closed quietly, sold through intermediaries who knew where to move things no one wanted to ask about. Rex was not an exception. He was evidence. The realization did not bring the satisfaction David had once associated with solving a case. It brought a low, steady anger tempered by grief. Some dogs, like some people, were deemed too damaged to matter. Inside the building, the meeting was brief and unceremonious. No speeches, no press. Just paperwork and signatures. David sat across from a small panel that included Mark and a county liaison, who spoke carefully, choosing words that did not reopen wounds. They were not asking David to come back as a police officer. They were not offering him a badge or a weapon. What they offered instead was acknowledgement. Rex was formally registered as a service, and Support K-9 cleared to assist in field observations and crisis response when appropriate. David would be listed as his handler not in replacement of Rex's past, but as his present. The phrasing mattered. David signed his name with a steady hand. It felt different than it had years ago. Not heavier, not lighter. Honest. When they stepped back into the cold, Rex walked at David's side, injured leg still evident but strong enough now to carry him without hesitation. Mark stopped near the steps, hands in his coat pockets, watching them. "You did good," he said. David shook his head slightly. He did. Mark studied Rex, then David. "You're not the same man you were," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "No," David agreed. "I don't think I was meant to be. The work didn't end with the paperwork. If anything, it shifted shape." Word traveled quietly through the department and beyond. Officers who had been on leave longer than they admitted. Deputies who avoided loud rooms and sudden movements. People who knew the cost of staying silent. David rented a small community room once a week, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. He never stood at the front. He sat among them, leather jacket shrugged off flannel sleeves, rolled boots planted on the floor. Rex lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes open. Always present. The first night only 4 people came. By the 3rd week there were 12. David didn't lecture. He talked about nights without sleep, about freezing when it mattered, about learning that coming back didn't mean pretending nothing had happened. He talked about Rex without mythologizing him, describing a dog who stayed when staying mattered. When someone's breathing faltered, Rex shifted closer, not touching unless necessary, his presence, a quiet anchor. No one asked him to perform. He never did. David noticed changes in himself, too. The guilt didn't vanish. It probably never would. But it moved. It no longer screamed at him in the dark. It became something he carried without letting it steer. He still startled at metal sounds. He still woke too early. The difference was that he didn't punish himself for it anymore. He had learned that freezing wasn't failure. Leaving was. And he wasn't leaving. One evening after the group dispersed, David stayed behind, stacking chairs slowly. Rex rose with effort and came to stand beside him, shoulder brushing David's knee. David rested a hand on the dog's back, fingers sinking into familiar fur. "You're still watching," he murmured. Rex's ears flicked tail, moving once deliberate and calm. Outside, the town carried on quietly. Kids learned Rex's name and waved when David passed. Shop owners set bowls of water near their doors without being asked. No one made a spectacle of it. Wyoming towns rarely did. The miracle, if it could be called that, was not loud enough for headlines. It lived in consistency. On the anniversary of the explosion, David drove out beyond town, parking near a ridge where the wind cut clean and cold. He stood there a long time, leather jacket creaking softly, scarf pulled tight. Rex sat beside him, facing outward, scanning the open land. David didn't speak to the past. He acknowledged it. He breathed. He stayed. As dusk settled, David felt a truth settle with it. He had not saved Rex. Rex had not cured him. That story would have been simpler, neater, and false. What they had done instead was refuse to disappear. Together. The work ahead would be slow and imperfect. Some nights would still be hard. Some memories would still intrude. But David no longer believed broken things were finished. He had seen too much evidence to the contrary, lying quietly at his side. They walked back toward the truck boots, crunching softly in the snow, a man and a dog moving in step. There was no applause, no closing speech, just the steady understanding that some guards never stand down. They simply change posts. And somewhere between loss and purpose, David Walker had found his place again, not as the man he used to be, but as the man who stayed. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire. They arrive quietly through broken people, wounded animals, and second chances we never believed we deserved. This story reminds us that God does not waste pain. What feels like loss can become purpose. What feels like the end can become a calling. David thought surviving was his failure, but God used his survival to bring healing not only to him, but to others still fighting unseen battles. In our daily lives, we pass by people who look forgotten, exhausted, or useless to the world. Do not turn away. That moment of compassion may be the miracle God placed directly in your path. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others can find hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to support stories that restore faith in humanity. May God bless you, protect you, and give you strength in every battle you face.